If you guys don't mind, I'm going to be recording this for my own benefit. It's not pointed on anyone. It might catch the back of your head. No. I want you to tell me if that's a problem. Because I don't want to record. I'm not that big of a creep. I don't want to record randos.
The glare might interfere with the camera.
Did you look at it?
Yeah, it seems to look okay.
Good.
Keep the camera here.
Oh, I don't want to do that.
No.
Oh, thank you.
Back to your head.
See what it looks like.
Yeah,
Is it
you're
clear?
good. Yeah. It catches the
Maybe
very
I'll go-
corner.
Maybe I'll go back. And,
No, you're totally good. I wouldn't stress.
You might have a little better luck on that shaped look there,
nobody's behind
so you
me.
can get more of a downward angle instead of up.
Or you could put it on this chair.
Are you back? Are you doing you or it?
Well, I'd like me and the board.
Yeah, how's that?
This is fine, I guess. I don't want to move it too much more. That might have been a better idea.
Oh, that way. Do you want to move your table? Also?
It's on wheels.
Ra trong cái động.
Cooking with gas.
Now you gotta lower it. Do you need to adjust like focus?
Should be okay. Yeah. We'll get started in a couple. These are all of my own creation. They're on my blog. So if you can't get enough, and you want to look at memes about technology. It's true. What have you brought?
She's crying already.
It's a tear-jerking presentation.
Too many jobs.
Look at the ETF on the bottom.
Yeah.
Not that one.
School,
we'll get started. Just so everyone knows, everything slides, there's no demo for this one, but all the slides will be available on the SQL Saturday Sacramento site and also on my blog, or also if you reach out to me on Twitter or LinkedIn or something. So no worries there. You are all here for environmental SQL Server troubleshooting. Thank you for attending my session. Hopefully we'll get some good value out of this. So my name is Jeff Malacher. I've been a DBA developer working with databases since probably about 2002. Getting paid very little at the beginning and then working my way up. Eventually I did manage to get a master's in info science at Pittsburgh, where I was born. And I'm interested in databases, security, InfoSec, and privacy stuff, which I blog about. I'm a team lead for a team of escalation engineers at Varonis. Varonis is a cybersecurity company I work for, and I have a small team of top-level support engineers that our job is basically to hotfix, patch, and fix bugs. But a lot of the times in the job, we found that the problem really wasn't the code. It was something environmental. That's the impetus for this presentation. So it'll show you a lot of the ways that things that aren't, before diving deep under the hood, it'll show you some things to look at and hopefully get your environment up. There's my contact info. All right, today we are going to talk about environmental. What do we mean by environmental? We mean things outside of the code. We mean something typically in SQL Server, a configuration or a setting, Windows Server. I know it runs on Linux, but we are only going to talk about Windows Server. And VMware, because everyone virtualizes, and those who virtualize use ESX. Sorry, Hyper-V and Zen. So things that aren't code related, things that aren't index related, but something in the environment is wrong that's slowing us down. So hopefully this stuff helps you performance tune. We'll get started with SQL Server. We're going to look at these few topics. We'll look at resource allocation in terms of memory, disk, and CPU. We'll look at instance level configurations for the server, and we'll look at database level configurations. A quick tour meant to be high level. So I like to start off with the most controversial one, maxstop. So the maximum degree of parallelization is the amount of processing cores the SQL Server will use to execute a parallel plan. Okay? It's supposed to help you run your workload a little bit faster. It determines thread and computing resources. The problem is the default is 0, and that means use them all. And as you'll see at the end, one of the themes throughout this presentation is the defaults are terrible. They're poor and they're working against you. So Microsoft likes to present SQL Server and their software as wizard-driven. Just keep hitting next, install it, hey, you did it. You're not going to get performance that way. You have to know what to look at, and this will help you point to that. We'll talk about cost threshold for parallelism in a moment. So the default is 0. That means use them all. That can be bad. Too much parallelization is like oversizing a VM. It's one of those things at first that sounds like how could that be a problem, and then you get into practice and it's a big problem. So the advice from Microsoft is if you have less than 8 logical cores, I believe NUMA nodes, you assign the value to be that number. So if you have a quad core machine, maxstop gets 4. I always like to err on the side of going under rather than over. So you could do 2 or 4. If you have 8 or more, just set it to 8 and walk away. We can tune it tighter later, but this is a good starting point. And until we have some evidence for what needs to be tweaked, it should just be 8. There are exceptions, but this is a good starting point. Let's talk about one of the exceptions, Sharepoint. What's the max stop supposed to be for Sharepoint? 1. It's supposed to be 1. You would never do that on a production server, but for Sharepoint, you do, okay? OLTP and OLAP, so a transactional processing database and a data warehouse. You might configure it a little bit differently. Which one would get more max stop? Your OLTP or your OLAP, if you're gonna choose? Yeah, absolutely, yeah. There are diminishing returns to setting this value. How do you know if there's max stop problems? No, it's cool. It's cool. How do you know if there's max stop problems? Well, it's not easy to directly pin it down, but usually I look at wait stats for statistics, usually CX packet, SOS scheduler yield. That doesn't mean you have a problem with max stop. That means it's worth looking at a little bit more. But these are great places to start to adjust your max stop. Since it's a global setting, it'll affect all the databases on your instance, so it's kind of a big deal, right? Cost threshold for parallelism is the cousin to max stop. The default's 5. The legend for this is years ago, I think after the Sybase port for SQL Server, developers in Microsoft in Redmond did performance testing, and they used a desktop of some developer. And they kept this arbitrary value, 5 cost threshold for parallelism. And it's 2019, and that doesn't make any sense anymore. So it's problematic. The way I like to think about CTFP is it's like horsepower. What's horsepower, you know? Are 300 horses, let's say, gonna outrun your Acura? Probably not. You know, it's just my point is it's just an arbitrary value used to represent usage. And in this case for SQL Server, it represents how expensive a query is, how much does it cost? And it does that in the query processing stage before it actually runs the query. If it determines it's going to cost greater than or equal to whatever you have set here, it will parallelize, and it will parallelize according to max stop. So that's the relation between these two. Max stop is the bigger one, but this is also important. Because if you leave it at 5 or some other small value, you're gonna parallelize almost everything. And you probably don't need to parallelize basic select statements and things like that. We wanna save that for jobs that are going to require a lot more work. Sometimes this is confused with the processor Affinity, which controls the processors that SQL Server will use. Can you think of an example where we would want to throttle that, where you would want to change this value? Because we typically want to use all our processors, right? Even standard edition is kind of expensive, servers, admins, licenses. If you had multiple instances on a machine, you might want to. I don't recommend it. You want it dedicated because it's very hard to troubleshoot something that's not dedicated, because now you have to investigate this other black box. Okay, memory is likewise terrible. The default is this humongous number that would never work. It means use them all. We want to cap that because otherwise it'll contend with the operating system when Windows Server needs to pull back some memory, because SQL Server is going to use everything that you give it. So it used to be the old advice, you'd have the min and the max, that you would set them to be the same. And by used to be, I mean like 2003. Nowadays, that's not necessarily the case. You can just set the min to be 0 and the max to be a formula that I will show you. So it has to depend on what else is running on the machine. So if you're running SSRS or SSIS or AS, or if you're running another application for some reason on your database server, you need to take that into consideration, because then the operating system has to give them some memory too. So we calculate how much the operating system needs, and we give everything else to SQL Server. Rule of thumb. This is a great link by Jonathan Cahias. He explains and tested and benchmarked how much memory does it need based upon different settings. Basically, his rule of thumb is 4 gig for the first 16 gig, and then 1 gig for every additional 16. This means for a 64 gigabyte server, we'd leave about 8. This is about the calculation that you can use. So total RAM, this is what goes to OS, this is what goes to SQL. If you have other apps or RSIS, you can take those into account too. Make sense? Okay. So CLR is, there's one little nuance about that. So in SQL Server 2012, it processed .NET assemblies and CLR calls differently. Before that, like 2008, rest in peace, it would do it in the operating system memory space. Therefore, you would err on the side of giving the operating system more memory. It's not the case anymore. It's addressed inside the memory space SQL Server hordes. So you can give it a little bit more. Yeah. All right, right, so we all know we need to separate our database files onto different disks. If you put all your disks on the same, if you put all your disks on the same disk, it won't make any sense. But if you put all your data files on the same disk, you're gonna have a bad time. These are a bunch of the breakdowns you can have. Your user and system database files, your transaction logs, tempdb. Hopefully you're sending backups to somewhere that's not where all this stuff is, because if that goes bad, then your backups are gone. Could be trace files, OS, SQL binaries, page file. You make the determination in your environment for what you think is best. But at an absolute minimum, keep the data files, the MDFs and NDFs, and the transaction logs, the LDFs, separated at a bare minimum. What do you put on the fastest disk?
Logs.
I'm sorry.
Logs.
Yeah. You're both right. So tempdb and transaction log is the answer. For most cases, you want it to be tempdb. Okay. If you have a high OLTP system, meaning you have a lot of transactions being processed, pumping through there, then you might want to put the transaction logs on that disk. So it really depends on your workload. Yes?
Is there any performance improvement with adding multiple page files? Usually it's on just the primary drive, but
Adding more secondary data files?
page files,
Page files, okay.
right? Like on the 10th drive or.
We talk about page file a little bit later.
Okay. Got it.
We'll get to it then.
Sure.
Okay, SSDs, game changer, huh? So, I mean, we all know the bottleneck, you know, just like with algorithm and computer science, processing is the fastest you're gonna get. Then we have memory, and it's orders of magnitude worse than CPU. Then at the bottom of the pyramid, we have disk. Disk is orders of magnitude worse than memory is. Solid state starts to compress that a little bit. So the best advice I've had from attending sessions like this of people who are smarter than me and describe it is that when you have solid state, let's say you have an all flash array, you can throw all your files on the same disk. The architecture is much different than a spinning disk, and it'll be just as performant. So you can separate them more for like a DBA if you wanted to logically manage things to make your life a little bit easier. Does that make sense?
When you say all your files, you're not saying transaction logs and tempdb all on the same disk.
Yeah, you could. I don't do that. I mean,
Okay.
but I do it for logical reasons. Like I want to manage files and file groups, but you could. So, just an example of how the setup could be, what we already talked about. All right, that's all for resources. Before we move on to instance configuration, any questions on the CPU, memory, and disk that we just talked about? Okay. Moving on to top level instance configurations. These are configurations at the instance level, meaning they impact all the databases on the instance. So there's a few settings that are worth going over. And a lot of these ones are going to be minor, but I bring them up because I've experienced it in the field. Like I said in the beginning with my job, we get on customer servers and we investigate. We sell software, how come our software is not working? What's wrong? And I've come across these before, and these are minor, but they can be a problem. So maximum worker threads is 0. That means let SQL Server handle itself. Just leave it alone. There are times when you would want to change this, and they are here in this link. You can have it be too limited, you can have it be too excessive. This link down here shows Microsoft gives you the formula for, based upon processing cores, how many worker threads SQL Server will use. There are times when you want to change it, so just be aware of that. What's this? Come on, make me feel younger. What is it?
It's the white box.
That's the hard disk activity log.
I mean the whole image.
Oh,
That's a flop.
This is a Packard Bell 386SX. This was my first computer. It was my dad's.
I thought you were doing what the yellow arrow is actually pointing.
Oh, no, oh, we're gonna get to that, yes. So, the reason I bring this up, all right, so there were 2 buttons on here. One was to reboot, and you know, it would show you, I think, disk, and the other one was called a turbo button. And it would be orange by default, but if you wanted to go into turbo mode, you can make it green. Okay, why am I bringing this up? There's a setting in SQL Server called Boost SQL Priority. This used to be relevant back in 1998, but not so much anymore. So kindly leave it unchecked. Just let SQL Server handle it. Like I said, decades ago, resources used to be a lot different. Now we can just throw memory at the problem and know everything's all good. All right, remote server connections. It's not what you think. So what does it sound like it means? Sounds like it means, can I RDP into this? Okay, it's not what it means. It means internally how linked servers communicate. Okay? So sometimes if you're troubleshooting an instance with linked server issues, this could be one of the reasons. It's been deprecated, don't use it, but of course deprecated in Microsoft parlance means it'll be around until I retire, so. The maximum number of concurrent connections, default 0, best to just leave this guy alone. There's an internal calculation that SQL Server uses. Just walk away from it and let it handle it. Remote query timeout, you want it to be 0, you don't want to start timing out things. It's hard to put a value on there, and someone runs a report that takes 8 hours, someone runs a maintenance job that takes 12 or 24. I don't want to kill them, so just leave it to be 0. Query wait is also over here. This is the time in seconds that a query will wait before timing out. So just leave it at the default. All right. One of the most important things on the instance level is TempDB. TempDB is a system database that's global to all databases on the instance. That they all use them. And the thing is, they all use them for almost everything. You can hardly run a select statement without using TempDB. Okay? You can hardly do anything. So TempDB is critically important, and its default is you're fighting the ocean. It's so poorly configured that it's gonna make you look bad. Here's what you do. The advice from Microsoft. TempDB, you want one TempDB data file per logical core up to 8, and then stop. You can run perfmon after that. You can do other performance analysis. You can go up, if you think you need it, in sets of 4, okay? An important thing is the initial size of the data file should be the same for all the files. This is important because, as I understand it, unless something's changed in 2019, SQL Server uses a round-robin algorithm to determine when a query is being processed. So what cores are going to go to what disk, or what TempDB file, sorry. If it is not all initialized to the same value, the algorithm will be degraded. So you are actively working against SQL Server if you choose to do this. Therefore, set them all the same. And remember, TempDB is rebuilt every time you restart the instance. So you can make the changes, it's just they won't take effect until your next quarterly maintenance window or whenever you guys patch servers. Auto growth should be done in megabytes, not in percentage. And that's just because it's easier for us to manage. So if we talk about 10%, let's say, well, 10% of a gig is a lot different than 10% of a terabyte, which is a lot different than 1.5 terabytes and so forth. It's just harder to manage. And when SQL Server has to ask the operating system, mother, may I have more disk? That's actually one of the most expensive operations that it can perform. So we want to limit that. We're just trying to reduce allocation contention. So if you have the ability, it's great to pre-size your TempDB, meaning initialize it. Initialize the sum of all the TempDB data files plus the log to be maybe 10% of the disk volume that's allocated to it. Therefore, it doesn't have to grow. And when you start getting alerts for low disk space, you know you have 10% to go. Another DBA trick that I've heard that someone else used was when they admin their servers and they don't want to get called at 3 in the morning because of a space issue and have to troubleshoot the whole thing. They'll fill up the disk closely and then they'll make a dummy file. It'll be a file that's basically just empty padded. That's all it is. It doesn't do anything. But it'll be like 50 gig. And that way they can wake up, delete the file, go back to sleep, come in at 7 or whatever, and then solve the problem. So just a pro tip life hack. There's a couple of trace flags that are important. There are 2 that are default in SQL 2016, by the way, which is a great version. 1117 and 1118. And if I have it right, 1117 means we are going to use all extents in the page. So in storage, you have a file, you have pages, you have extents. There's 8K extents in a page. Correct me if I'm wrong.
You're wrong.
Oh, sorry. See? Thank you. Okay, these trace flags will help your performance go a lot better. So if you're running 2014 or 2012, or if you're still on 2008, it's end of life, so gotta get off that. You can apply these trace flags. And one comment is to apply them at the startup params too. So when you enable them, they're gonna be active and global on the instance, but when they restart SQL Server, it won't be there anymore. So you have to add it to the startup params under the service, okay?
For the files, for multiple files?
Yeah.
Would you put all those on the same disk?
For TempDB?
Yes.
You can.
Okay.
I know some people who choose to separate their transaction log for TempDB from it, but most of the time, my experience, just put it all on the same disk.
Okay.
But once again, your mileage may vary, so you know your workloads better, you can test and see.
Will you put your 10 DB database and 10 log at the same location or separate?
You can put them at the same. Just keep it away from your other files. Does anyone know different from that? Do you guys know that it's better to separate even them? I've read mixed things online from Microsoft, so it's not crystal clear, but I throw them all on TempDB. Okay, so we have 2 settings, auto close and auto shrink. What's auto close mean?
So, the last user disconnects you. So
Yeah,
close that.
you know, of all the features that should have been deprecated, this is one of them. Why would you ever want to do this? There are some use cases for why you might want to do this based upon your application. But, you know, for the most part, the whole point of this server is to be up and running 24/7, 365. I don't want to shut it down every time Tom logs off and then 8 hours later fire it back up. That just seems counterproductive, right? Auto shrink is quite nefarious. This is a really good KV from Microsoft that explains it. Shrinking is generally frowned upon and bad. So this is also a controversial topic. I've gotten into many online fights about this. If you're shrinking on the reg and you're not checking root cause or doing some kind of performance monitoring, you're not doing a good job. Like, that is a metric that you're not playing it right. And I know DBAs will say, well, I have it in full recovery mode, I have to do it, this is just the nature of it. Yeah, that's true to a point, but if you're doing it on the reg, you're not sized right. Your queries aren't configured to use an appropriate amount of the transaction log. There's other factors at play, because shrinking creates a ton of fragmentation. Okay, sure, you could update statistics, you could run index maintenance. Okay, you could, but there's an impact. So basically, we don't want to shrink, and we sure as hell don't want to let SQL Server just start auto shrinking. We good with that? Anyone want to contest my strong opinion of shrinking? It won't be the first fight I've gotten into. Okay, database file defaults. Just like TempDB, we want to consider the initial size and we want to consider the auto growth. There's also the max size. Your call. If you're going to cap the max size, you need to have disk monitoring in place, okay? Because remember, when the disk gets filled up or when the file is filled up and isn't allowed to ask for more, it's a showstopper. You're no longer available. Down, man down, code red, right? So the default, I think in 2016, is 8 megabytes for a database. How many of you are rocking 8 megabyte databases? You know? So once again, asking the operating system to give me more disk space is one of the most expensive operations it can do, okay? We want to limit that. And if you set it to 8 megabytes and then you start bumping it up by a number that's equally as absurd, it's gonna be terrible performance until it gets ramped up in size to where it ought to be. So whatever you can do in advance, you can change this in model, then all of your user databases that are created can follow suit. All right, any questions on the SQL Server section? Good speed, too fast, too slow?
Good.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay, operating system. This one's a little bit lighter. There's some things to talk about. We'll talk about general configurations. We'll talk about power options, antivirus, instant file initialization, the page file, failover clusters, firewalls, scheduled tasks, and disk partition alignment. A lot of these are kind of old and not worth knowing much about, but I mention them because there are some fringe cases. We'll get to the most important one in a minute. So, we don't want Windows to just update our server and start rebooting it, so turn that stuff off. Okay. Roles and features. So if it's a database server, if it's a server that was provisioned just for SQL Server, it probably doesn't need to be a domain controller. So we would not install the Active Directory role feature, right? That's what we're talking about here. Keep it clean. If it's not a print server, I know it's small, you don't need to add that. So kind of like in security, the principle of least privilege, kind of the same logic here. And you have to consider what non-SQL Server software is running on this machine, because that'll impact how we go. This is the most important by far, the power option. This is as close as I can get to an actual turbo button. I've walked into many a customer's environments, physically in person, flying on site and online, and this is a magic button that I push, and everything improves dramatically. If you don't believe me, just get a weak machine like your laptop, put, World of Warcraft or something on it, and put it on balance, see how that works. Now try doing that for a server. It's a terrible idea. Microsoft leaves balance as the default because they want to be green. You've spent a lot of money on SQL Server. You spent a lot of money on servers and admins. This is such a cheap trick to pull out. It's an enterprise grade system. It needs to have full power. We don't want to throttle it, okay? Always, always, always set it to high performance.
Is that a setting that's available on VMs as well, or is that just a physical?
We get into that on the next slide. Yeah.
What was that path? Control panel, hardware, power?
Yeah, control panel, hardware, power. I normally just hit the Windows button and then I type in power, OPT, because if I just type power, it'll give me PowerShell, and I want power options. But yeah, this is a great cheap trick. I know it sounds stupid. I'm in front of you all talking about this. I cannot tell you how many times, and how many people here are consultants? Okay, I'm sure you deal with that stuff like this a lot, where it's like, everything's on fire, I don't know what's wrong. Okay, everything's good now. This is one of the rare ones you can pull out. There is some trickery involved with this. Keep in mind that power settings can also be determined at the BIOS level. So if you're running an HP ProLiant or Dell PowerEdge or whatever it is you're running, it can be configured in the BIOS, so that could be working against you. As a DBA, there's not much we can do about that. This is where you have to make friends and buy beer for the storage engineering team to go through this. Or the VM team, based on the next slide. I have had instances where power settings were determined by group policy. Mm-hmm.
On the previous slide there, one thing I've heard that can require a restart to take effect?
No.
Okay.
No. Unless I'm wrong, does anyone think differently? My understanding is, because I don't want to lie to you or tell you I'm not 100%, but I'm 99% sure it doesn't require a reboot. But processes that are currently running, they're going to currently run under that auspice.
So restart SQL service then?
Well, no, let the query finish. I mean, the next time it runs on job,
okay.
That sort of thing. Okay. I was at a large financial institution in New York. They were having tons of problems. They demanded an engineer on site, so they send me, right? So I go there, and they're having all types of global performance issues, things that kind of scream something environmental and globally, because no matter what you would do, it was just that way. Okay, I found their power settings were balanced. It's great, I changed it to high performance. I'm on site all week, come back the next day, it's balanced. Hey, did you change it? No. You need to check with your team. Did anyone change it? It's kind of a big deal, right? No, we didn't. Okay, fine, come in again after I do the same thing. Realize they had a group policy. It'll just keep reverting it. Okay, so this is some trickery to be aware of, and this is how you get to it. Kind of minor-ish, but it's a good gotcha. And lastly, in vSphere, you can also set power settings there too, okay? And that's where they are, and that's the link for it. All right, so besides power settings, antivirus is the other big thing here. So a lot of organizations are forced and coerced to run AV scans on all of their servers, without exception, right? You don't really need to be doing it on your SQL server, but you have to get around it and follow policy and be compliant. So the thing to do is to make sure that all of your database files are whitelisted. So that means MDFs, LDFs, backups, traces, SQL binaries, anything, any file on your file system that is dependent upon database files should be whitelisted. I've had cases with customers where they would have unbelievably bad performance for 1 or 2 hours out of the day. And it just always seemed to happen at 2 p.m., right? So we go into SQL Server and we can't really tell much. We go into the operating system and we realize that it's locking up all of our database files because the AV scan's running and that's what it'll do. So this is poison for a prod environment. So make sure you whitelist them. This was another cheap trick, told the customer to whitelist it. All problems, just gone. You know, it really can be that simple sometimes, if we're lucky, right? Instant file initialization, I have a few slides on it, but I'll just kind of breeze through it. It's kind of default now. It was a feature in 2005 to, when disk space is requested, to start zeroing out and null ending the files, okay? It basically is a net performance game. So it used to be the file wasn't available until everything was zeroed out. It still is, but it's just much quicker now. So in the SQL Server error log, which you should all DBA should become intimately familiar with. Reading logs is not sexy, but it's RTFM. It's in the logs. The truth is in the error log, right? You can set this under a local security policy, like so. You can add the SQL account to it as well. In 2016, they added a setup when you install an instance that is basically for IFI. And here's the command line, important bits. Okay. So once again, in 2016, it's a big paradigm shift. It's a lot better in a lot of different ways.
This is 2016 plus? Okay.
Yeah, 2016 plus, so that would be 2017, 2019, all of that. The pros are basically improved performance. There are some cons. Yes, sir.
That checkbox in the installer, is that supposed to throw the service account into the local group policy?
I actually don't know.
I don't think I've ever actually seen that happen. So I always throw it in the local group policy.
Yeah, I also don't think it does that. Good point. There are some cons. There are small security considerations to be aware of. They're minor. You can't use transparent database encryption, so no TDE if you're going to use IFI. So if you are using that, can't do it. Overall, the pros outweigh the cons. This is all kind of default-ish stuff right now, and as you can see, SQL 2016 installer is kind of putting it out there, but just keep it in mind. This might be a little knob or a switch you tweak a little bit. Page files. All right, page files are a special kind of file that's used to spill over into disk to make memory extents long enough to process, right? holds data that's being swapped in and out of physical memory because it's giving you a virtual memory set to help the operating system process whatever it's trying to do. If you have large page files, they deserve their own disk, like we talked about earlier with disk partition or disk breakdown, your MDFs, your transaction logs, your temp DB. If you have a large page file, this is also something that ought to be on its own disk. What does lots of page file usage mean? Yeah, it's hinting you have memory pressure. If you're constantly writing, if you're constantly spilling over and swapping to disk, you don't have enough memory to do what you're trying to do. All of this can be sussed out with perfmon, for example. A perfmon counter can reveal we have tremendously high page file usage. These are the counters that are worth looking at. Like I said, all of this will be posted, so we'll just skip through it. And a few links. All right, Windows Server failover clustering. This is an extremely important, large topic. I've devoted one slide to it. Basically, just be aware that if you do failover clustering, you need to follow best practices because failover clustering is a little bit more complex and nuanced. Now you need to know something about SQL Server, but you need to know something about Windows Server. Well, you better know something about network, Active Directory, and storage as well. All of that is incumbent in this. So just be aware, the entire books have been written about failover clustering, just be aware that the cluster needs to be set up right, and these are the best practices.
In 2017, is there a threshold of once you initiate a failover, manual or by design, at what point should you re-trigger it to fail back to the problem?
Well, I mean, a lot of people do high availability with failover clustering for patching. So if you want your system to be available and you need to install a service pack or you need to update Windows or whatever it is, you can manually, in that case, fail it over, perform your patchwork, fail it back over, perform the patchwork on the other one. So now your active, passive, your primary, secondary are patched up. Does that kind of answer your question?
Not really. Is there a preference which node should be primary versus secondary?
What do you mean? I mean, I would think.
I guess I can ask this question after the class.
Okay. Yeah, I might not be understanding exactly what you mean, but we can definitely talk about it afterwards, no problems. Firewalls. All right, so if you're going to run, you know, SSMS debugger, that's no longer in the new SSMS client, it's in Visual Studio. You have to open this port. These are some other valuable ports. This is the default SQL port that you want open. This is the Microsoft link for how to configure it to allow access. So I was on site with a customer. I don't do this too much. I only do it when there's a true dumpster fire and there's kittens inside, right? So we get on site and they're having massive connectivity issues trying to reach out to a NetApp, okay? So the customer was upset. They were blaming my software company's product. I can tell you without even going there, it's not our product. That's just not how this thing works. So we get on site, they're mad as hell, get Microsoft on the phone because they're a big company and they have, you know, nice support. Microsoft's like, oh shit, I don't know what to do with that. So they ended up getting NetApp on the phone. And a few minutes later, we found out the problem. The problem was the firewall was blocking it. And we hit that button to allow it to pass through. All the problems better. Sounds stupid, but useful. Let's talk about maintenance jobs real quick. So all DBAs should be doing backups, consistency checks, index maintenance, updating statistics, file management, stuff like that. That's all cool, but you have to pay attention to when they run, okay? Example, I've troubleshot some customers' cases out in the wild, out in the field, where they were having terrible performance overnight, maybe from like 3 a.m. to 5 a.m. all the time. Or throughout the day, I've had that too. And they'll have a bunch of deadlocks being pulled as well, right? So the reason in this case was because they were running index maintenance like constantly. So everyone knows the open source Ola Hallegren scripts, which are awesome, they're great. But once again, it's a tool. You know, we need a brain behind that. You can't just click, click, click and run it and everything's going to be okay. If you're running index maintenance like I've seen every hour, yeah, I know. You're going to break jobs. Whatever batches are trying to run in SQL Server, they're going to be executing in flux, and then this is going to come blow away their index, and it's going to fail. It's going to time out. It's going to deadlock. So this is something to be aware of.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Is there some preference for running this kind of stuff from like a Windows scheduled task as opposed to a SQL agent job?
I typically see it as a SQL agent job or a third-party software that does this stuff and that manages your backups for you. Do you do it through a cron job like scheduled maintenance?
No, typically through SQL agent.
Yeah.
But I feel there is some advantage to one way or the other.
I couldn't say. I couldn't rightfully say, to be honest with you. I hadn't thought about that.
If you're using Express, you don't have your SQL.
Oh, Express, yes.
That's really.
This guy found the exception, thank you.
That's the weird one.
Yeah, typically I work with standard and enterprise. Everything else is kind of not supported-ish. This is kind of an old slide. It's just how we present storage to the system. We want 64 kilobyte clusters for optimal performance. The Windows default used to be this, depending upon what version of Windows Server you're on. So this is something that could be changed, and this is how you do it. It's minor, but I only mention it for nuance. All right, any questions on the Windows Server part of this? The big takeaways there are going to be the power options and antivirus. Yep.
Well, I was going to circle back to the CPU that you mentioned previously. Is there any, I've noticed performance differences with the number of, in a virtual environment with cores versus threads. So for example, if you have a 4-core 2-thread versus a single core 8, you're going to have different performance.
That is, I know exactly what you're talking about. That is true. And by the way, the online documentation that you'll read, you have to be careful. There's a lot of great blogs to read, but buyer beware. Some people don't know what they're talking about, and anyone can write this. There's a lot of cruft on the internet that says, yeah, the best practice is to give one processing core per socket from VMware. So if you want if you want your virtual machine, your guest VM, to have 16 processing cores, not hyper-threaded, just 16 cores, you want to present it like you would on a motherboard, on a North Bridge, South Bridge kind of way of thinking. You wouldn't give it one socket for every core. But that advice is out there, and I can tell you firsthand it's wrong and it's bad. And if you change it, your life will get a lot better. But buyer beware, because there is some stuff out there that says that. And that's probably what led people to put yourself in that position. You have to do it. All right,
Go
ready
back
for?
to your previous slide, the disk partition.
Yeah.
Do you think it's worth to switch to 64K? Are we still using the default, which is always like the first one?
Yeah. I forget what version of Windows Server. There's one that's, I think 2012 and up is defaulted. This is kind of an old slide. This is becoming deprecated and not important anymore. Could be removed in my next SQL Saturday presentation.
I cannot remember how big is the KB. Our network team just asked me, do you want to change it? I say, what's that for? Okay, let me check.
I mean, if you're storing it on an EMC or a NetApp, you can just usually let that ride. But if you're storing it on a Windows 6 share, then you might want to look at that.
So
All
yeah,
right.
this hasn't been, this best practices hasn't been updated since 2008.
For this slide?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, really? Does it have another version?
It's 4K.
SQL Server 2008 and 2008 R2 sunset on us last month for extended life support, totally gone. Yep, this is a candidate for removal. Thank you for that. I will remove it. It will become, it's not relevant anymore, but it used to be.
No, it still is. It's
It's still relevant.
The default is now 4K, not 1.
Why would they do that?
Well, because most of your files are not going to be that big.
Yeah, tricky stuff.
I don't believe it. I change it every time.
Oh, good.
Every install, I leave that slide.
I forgot to ask this at the beginning before we get into the next part. How many people here would identify more as an administrator, sysadmin, DBA? All right, how about the development side of the world? How about something else like BI or analysis or something? Okay.
I'm like a DBA, BI.
Okay, great. Especially if you're a DBA on a development system, this stuff can be useful. Okay. How many people feel comfortable with VMware and virtualization? If I gave you vSphere, you'd know what to do with it. A lot more than previous sessions. All right, so we're gonna talk about just a couple of settings and tips and tricks that I've found in the field that involved VMware that, once again, just like before, hit of a button and everything performs better. So everyone virtualizes on VMware and everyone virtualizes, so it's good as a DBA to know something about it. Virtualization is something that all DBA should know about, but they don't. And this will put you a little bit ahead of the crowd. Kind of like if you can also script or write code, that'll put you far ahead of the crowd, okay? We'll talk about the best practices. There's a VMware white paper released, I think last year, that's just fantastic. That I think I have a link for, and that's good to read. We'll talk about general configurations and then CPU ready percentage, memory ballooning, and disk, okay? There are some links just for configuring and troubleshooting from VMware for SQL Server. You can read on your own. There are some performance counters in here that you can use. Just gonna skip through these. All right, CPU ready. What's CPU ready performance metric? Do you know what that means? Okay. You have a host machine, a big, beefy server. VMware is installed on it. It's the hypervisor is the pseudo operating system that manages all of the guest VMs within VMware. Does this make sense? Okay, so you have 100 guest VMs sharing resources, right? Then provisioning things. You can over-provision a machine such that there is CPU pressure on the vSphere host. And what has to happen is the hypervisor goes, you need CPU? You need CPU? Oh, you need CPU, give me yours, because I don't have any more. And then you're waiting until it gets to you, and you just lost it and you're waiting. This is one of those performance metrics that leads to global degradation of performance, okay? Did that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
I need to find better analogies for this sort of a thing. David Klee is a great resource online to read about this. Anything by him is rock solid gold.
How do you pronounce, spell that?
I wonder if I have it here. No. K-L-E-E. I could have sworn I had a link to this stuff in here. But we want to try and, as he puts it, right-size the machine. So you can over-provision it. I'm just going to make a totally contrived example. You have a VM host that has 64 processing cores. And you create a bunch of guest VMs and you give them all 64 processing cores. Okay, that's how you end up with a high percentage, right? So there's really only two choices that you have. You can either, one, add resources to the vSphere host, not gonna happen, or two, change the allocations to the guest VMs. CPU ready percentage, anything under 5%, that's great. But the truth is, if it hits around 3%, you're really gonna notice it. And I mean, everything is gonna lock up. You'll be waiting SLS scheduler yield and all that until the cows come home. So there's a really good link for converting the value that the performance tab in vSphere will give you for this, kind of like perfmon-ish stuff. These are some examples. It gives you a summation value, and these are the division that you would perform based upon what period of time you looked at. All right. This in old school vSphere, this is the console one, this is 5 point something, not 6. Under the performance tab, you can select the metrics for summation. You get the max, min, and average. I typically like to calculate off of max and average to determine if there's a problem, and this is one way you can do that.
Is there a recommended matrix in regards to CPU allocations?
For
Because
presenting-
obviously from a host perspective, you have a physical limit where your virtual cannot exceed that threshold.
Mhm.
So given that, is there a specific allocatric matrix from a best practices standpoint for?
I don't think that there is, but you can put a reservation on a guest VM.
Is that even recommended though, on reservations?
It kind of defeats the whole purpose of virtualizing. I've seen some people do it in isolated fringe cases. I personally don't think it's a good idea. I mean, once again, it just defeats the whole purpose. The whole reason we're virtualizing is because of inefficient CPU memory disk utilization. So we virtualize and everything just gets tighter, you know, and that kind of takes it away. When you put a reservation on something, that hurts. And maybe it's good for that VM, but it's gonna hurt everything else pretty bad. Okay. So this is a good one. I've had many cases where we got called in for a performance problem. Okay, examine SQL Server, dive right in. Well, everything kind of looks good there. I mean, I see performance problems, but everything's configured right. Go to Windows Server, okay, things look to be configured right. Gotta check out the hypervisor layer. Then you have this problem. Sample of the calculations. I don't know if you can see this too well on the back. This is an insane average and max. This was something I actually came across. This is an example, this kind of output of all your VMs on the host being terrible. All of them, because the CPU ready percentage is so high that the hypervisor is constantly context switching and taking resources from one VM to give it to another, to give it to another. Any questions about CPU ready percentage? Okay. The other one that's really big is memory ballooning. You know what memory ballooning is? It's a similar principle to CPU ready, only it's with memory. You got enough memory, you got enough memory, you got enough memory, you got enough memory. Oh, you don't have enough memory, I'm gonna take it from you and give it to her. It can create contention and problems. So this is something we wanna track. This is a counter we wanna look at. You can put a memory reservation. You can put a CPU reservation and you can put a memory reservation. I rarely see CPU reservations, and I don't think, my personal opinion is I don't think they're a good idea, but I do on occasion see memory reservations. So just know that in vSphere, you can create a reservation for this VM if you wanna prioritize it. There's also a priority on the CPU side. You can say, this guest VM, when we're checking, do you need, you get priority. Make sense?
So doesn't that really mean you have a wrong sized, virtual machine?
Sure could be.
Yeah, okay.
For memory ballooning, for example?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so any memory ballooning is too much. If it's a positive value, you're gonna notice it. Everyone's gonna notice it. That's just the way it works. So if you do see that, it's super, super bad. And what can you do? Just like with CPU, you only have two choices. You can either give the host hypervisor, which is running all these guest VMs, more resources. That's never gonna happen. That costs a lot of money and time. Nobody's gonna do that unless it really is undersized. You're gonna have to go into the guest VMs you have control over and make sure that the resources presented to them are what we need and not more. We don't wanna oversize. It creates all kinds of problems. And oversizing memory, I think which was what you were getting to, can lead to memory ballooning. You have a terabyte of memory on your vSphere host. You have X amount of VMs. You give them all a crazy amount of memory that's multiples higher than what the host has. Yeah, it's gonna create pressure. Even if it's not, necessarily using it all, it's going to create contention. So under performance and vSphere chart options, ballooning, that's what you need. This is what you wanna see. We wanna see zeros. We wanna see no memory ballooning. I mean, other performance counters are useful, looking at memory utilization, but for this, we just want to look at ballooning. If you see memory ballooning, you know the VM isn't right size, and that's probably the source of your global problems. I've had this happen, made a tweak to how we presented resources to the guest VM that was running our application, no problems. Lastly, Paravirtual SCSI is a disk adapter that is made for high throughput systems. SQL Server is a high throughput system. So I realize this is kind of small, but there is an option when you edit a VM where you can check this and it'll use that. It'll use that disk drive. Question? Okay, it'll get you much better performance. So if you are seeing I/O problems, but you can't quite pin it down to one of the other layers, this is one place where it could be. Make sense? All right, let's wrap this up. A summary, what I've tried to go through today. So the most important thing to tell you is the defaults are bad. They're not inadequate, they're terrible, okay? They are working against you, and I can't help that that's what they are, but the tips and tricks I've given in here are things I employ every day, and many other people do, and it'll get you free performance. You don't have to refactor a query necessarily. You might have to, but a lot of times, in my experience, it's really something environmental that's off, and that's where you go to fix it. And it feels really great when you can touch a button and everything works better. Those are the times I wish I was a consultant and I could, present a huge bill for that, right? We're building off the problem, not the fix. Okay. Defaults are terrible. Use best practices, but best practices are guidelines. I'm not trying to say don't do them. What I'm trying to say is you kind of have to master your martial art before you go create another one. You kind of have to master best practices before you know when to step outside of the box, when you have to customize it. And it involves a lot of testing. These are just guidelines. Your mileage may vary. Learn the exceptions. All right, that's everything I have for you. If anyone has any questions, happy to take them now or later. I will have everything posted to my blog and SQL Saturday Sacramento site you can pull down when I'm at the airport tonight. And thank you all for attending.
Hope you turned it on.
I know.
Very good, thank you.